Good afternoon. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about some of the work we do in forest ecosystems, and I tried to zero in for the latter part of this about, New Mexico specific stuff. But I come at this from a variety of different angles, and one of the hats I've worn over the years is that I worked in the carbon offset world as a consultant. And so I figured I'd give a little bit of background kind of in general structure of how offset projects work in forests, and then kind of segue into why some of those don't work in New Mexico and are fire-prone forests. All right, so we'll start off kind of a generic overview of the offset system and how it's structured. Talk about a few commonalities amongst projects. There's some like core things that are pretty important. And they also, I bring them up because they influence the way I think about ecosystems. And then, we'll get into some considerations that are specific to forests that are often overlooked. And then finally, talk a lot about managing carbon in southwestern forests. So this is functionally how the world is organized in the offset world. And so, there's these international standards, these ISO standards, 14064, and 65 that kind of govern everything. And, and then down here is what everybody thinks of in terms of like where the offset projects are developed. And for years, I worked as a consultant for ANAB evaluating the technical competence of these third-party verifiers and validators. So basically checking their statistics and stuff like that to make sure they were doing a good job in that. But this is functionally this piece right here is what most kind of forest owners and project developers deal with. And then, it's really kind of mapping this out in the context of how the system functions. And you have Climate Action Reserve or the Vera or American Carbon Registry, right? They're the program and they develop the protocols through whatever process. And then, those things get implemented in a project, third-party verified, and then there's some registry that serializes that stuff, and then you buy them from there. So from a forest perspective, there's two big things, and these are pretty common, I think, to most offset projects, but they've got kind of special flavor in forestry. And so additionality, which is the idea that the forest practice has to sequester more carbon than business as usual. And then permanence, which is the length of time that has to be sequestered. And that's increasingly problematic. The California Air Resources Board has caught some flack in the media for this because, things like mortality happen, big wildfire events, drought-induced mortality, insect outbreaks, and that really impacts permanence. And so, kind of in the basic sense, additionality is really like if you've got a industrial timberland and on a say 35 or 40 year rotation on the west side of the Cascades, and you take it out of production, that's pretty clear-cut case for additionality. And then permanence is just some number that whatever program sets up, that it has to be stored for. And so in most forestry projects, it's between 40 and 100 years. So Climate Action Reserve's on the far end. A lot of the others, it's around the 40-year mark. And so, the other concepts too in this that are important for forest projects are baseline. So what's the business as usual carbon stock? And I'll get into some examples of this in a second. And then leakage. So, how are the project activities influencing the market, basically? Are they causing, if you're stopping harvest on a patch of ground, are you causing increased harvest in another location? And so there's three general project types that are, they run under different names for each of those programs that are available domestically. There's afforestation, reforestation, improved forest management, and then reduced emissions from degradation, deforestation, or American Carbon Registry will call this avoided conversion. I think it might be the same in Climate Action Reserve, but the punchline is the same. They all function in these kind of three buckets. And so just to give you an idea, I'm going to step through each of these types really quick and talk about baseline and then how that works. And so in afforestation, reforestation, we're just got this is, you know, carbon density, so carbon per hectare, and then time. And then, you know, the red line in this case is just what that baseline case is. And so if this is, say, a bottomland, what was formerly bottomland hardwood, and it's been used for agriculture for 50 years, and you go decide that the productivity is fallen down, and so you're going to do a reforestation project, and you plant it, you know, the little bit of carbon in the system, in that agricultural system, is your baseline case. And then, you know, you can basically plant it and look at how that carbon stock develops over time, and at each time point, you know, you basically have that additional carbon sequestered on the site for sale. So these ones are really, I think, clear-cut to understand. The big components are baseline, so that one's, like, this is the easiest case, one of the easiest cases in terms of establishing the baseline, because if you're planting an area, eventually, ideally, those trees survive and grow, and you end up with more carbon stored in that location. Additionality is, you know, obviously you're doing that work. Permanence, again, depends on the registry, but, you know, mortality and management and disturbance can all be important factors that influence the risk to the project. So one of the things in a reforestation project, you often plant at a higher density than ideally you want. And so you want to do your modeling based on the kind of stand conditions you want to end up with, so that you're not overestimating the carbon storage in that landscape. And then, you know, leakage is a tough one to figure out. Is reforesting this patch of ground going to cause land clearing in another place to support whatever the activity was? All right, so then we have improved forest management. And so this is a really kind of generic example where you've got like a seed tree harvest or a shelter wood harvest, where you go in, you whack it, let it grow, whack it, let it grow, whack it. And then the offset project is maybe you go to a single tree selection system, and so you're taking less biomass at each harvest period. And then, you know, the difference between these curves is where your offsets are. So improved forest management, you know, identifying what is business as usual is a bit problematic. You've probably seen stuff in the news, particularly from the Northeast, where, you know, like some land conservancy has a patch of ground, and through improved forest management, they've generated all these carbon credits, but there was never any intention of them slicking it off in the first place. But the protocols are basically, they have that allowance. So a lot of times the business as usual case is what is legally allowable, right? And so it's not the landowner necessarily gaming the system, it's that the system needs some attention to improve it. Additionality in this case is really just about changing management. Permanence, the same issues, and leakage is the same thing. This is a really hard one, though, leakage with any sort of wood fiber piece, because wood fiber markets are global, and, you know, how do you demonstrate that, you know, that, I mean, the demand's going to get met somewhere. So I think everybody just kind of holds their nose and pretends with these things that's not the case. And then we have RED projects, so reduced emissions from degradation, deforestation. This is when you're just trying to conserve the forest, right? And so a lot of times in the tropics is where most of this happens. But you've got some, you know, carbon density across the landscape, and you're looking at, you know, what the deforestation rate is. So you usually estimate that from satellite data over some period of time, and you figure out what the deforestation pressure is. And then you build, a lot of times these are really social and economic systems in order to offer people economic opportunity outside of clear cutting and clearing the forest to convert to other things, and then you're able to sell those offsets as income. And so, you know, increasingly we're seeing these types of projects happen at a jurisdictional scale, so the World Bank is involved, and so, like, not country level, sub-country level, but big areas. And that's frankly probably the best way to go about it, because if you look at the what controls deforestation rates and stuff like that within a country, it's usually their legal structure. So again, these ones I think are the identifying the business as usual is a bit problematic, because what it requires is that you draw a boundary around the project area and you say, okay, that's where my deforestation happens, and then you calculate it over time. And there's a lot of things that can influence what happens within that boundary. You know, the additionality, stopping land clearing, permanence, you know, in a lot of places in the developing world, illegal logging is still a challenge, and then even illegal charcoal production and stuff like that are pressures on these tropical forests. But you know, and this is where like REDD+, the plus element, which is the social aspects, comes into play. And if you've got a good economic development plan, you don't have these sorts of problems because everybody's figured, you know, they can make more money, you know, operating within whatever structure is developing in that location. And then leakage, you know, is another issue. That's where the economic piece comes in as well. So, you know, just some registries that are operating here in the U.S. Climate Action Reserve is U.S. and Mexico. Vera has stuff all over the world, but they have some protocols that are applicable to the U.S. And then American Carbon Registry is another U.S. one. They're actually an outfit that was started by Winrock International maybe 10 or 15 years ago. All right. Any questions on that kind of generic overview before I plow ahead? Yeah.
That American Carbon Registry has a really good, fairly updated 1-hour session online explaining a lot of these offsets.
Cool. It's good to know. Anyone else? Okay. So I want to make 2 points here before I start talking about stuff specific to New Mexico. So for the last, I don't know, 20 years, it seems like I go to meetings and there's always some person, usually a young person who hasn't read the literature, that says we need to cut down trees and plant young trees because they sequester carbon at a faster rate. Well, rate is less important, and it's about, yeah, it's about mass, right? And so Nate Stevenson and colleagues published this paper 2014, and it was a global database of like 800 tree species, and I think there were 3 that this title didn't hold for, you know? And so, I mean, it's allometric scaling, right? And so big trees take up lots of carbon, even if the ring width is not very wide. And so eventually I hope this misunderstanding dies, but I'm not confident in that, and I would venture to guess that I go to a conference in 2 weeks and I'll probably see a poster on this. But, you know, and then this is just basic allometric scaling I did for a pine, generic pine allometric equation. And if you take a 50 centimeter diameter tree, it puts on 2 30 centimeter diameter trees in growth every year in carbon, right? And, you know, 130 centimeter diameter tree, it's, what is that, 8, you know? And the first time I ever showed policy folks this was actually out in the field, you know, and I was standing next to this giant sugar pine that was like 190 centimeters diameter at breast height, and next to it is this little white fir. And what I was saying is that we want to cut down this to save this big one, you know, and then I pull out my D-tape and do the math, and I'm like, and this takes up like 9 or 10 of those a year, you know, and then it like starts clicking, right? Big trees are really important from a carbon uptake perspective. Increasingly, though, they're at risk to, you know, a drying atmosphere and warming temperatures. But anyway, now I want to take it to New Mexico and some work we've been doing, because really I think that, you know, from a kind of carbon perspective, what all of our work has shown in these kind of fire-maintained ecosystems is that we really need to focus on stabilizing carbon in the system and less about trying to increase the carbon stock. And so a large part of that has to do with the fact that we've got these feedbacks between climate, forests, and disturbance, right? And so, you know, we last year was a bad, great example, right? We had we've been 2 years of dry winters, a little bit of precipitation, not enough to truly saturate the system. It was very flashy. A lot more of the fuel in the ecosystem was available for combustion, and then all we had ignition, and we had, you know, 3 large, fast-moving wildfires. Similar things. I mean, we're seeing this happen. So, you know, basically the climatic controls on these really big, fast-moving fires started to lift in the Southwest in the early 2000s. And we've been watching it march north in latitude since then. California, about 6 or 7 years ago, really started to get its piece. I mean, we already had ours down here, you know, we're on that train left the station a while ago, and now it's it's left the station in California. Oregon is, you know, just got its own taste. You know, and now BC's burning, right? This is just one of those things we can kind of watch it march north. And it's as the atmosphere gets warmer and drier and sucks more moisture out of the ecosystem, the whole thing becomes more flammable. And so when we think about it in terms of carbon dynamics in these ecosystems, a concept that's really useful for me to think about these things is really this idea of a carbon carrying capacity. And so what that is it's basically the amount of carbon you can expect to store in the ecosystem given prevailing climate and prevailing natural disturbance conditions. So, you know, if this is, say, we're going to, you know, call this the live tree carbon stock, and let's call this a lodgepole pine forest, which has a, you know, stand replacing fire regime every 150 years or so. Trees grow up, you know, live tree carbon goes up, bam, fire kills all the trees, burns up a bunch of stuff. And then if we have the same climatic conditions and the same natural disturbance conditions, we'd expect over the same time period that carbon stock would recover. But increasingly, we're seeing more of this on the landscape. And the east flank of the Jemez Mountains, especially if there's a Forest Road 289, if you drive down that, you can see the effect of 3 high-severity wildfires on top of each other, one in the 90s, one in the early 2000s, and then one in 2011. And, you know, it's the likelihood that ever ends up as forest in any, you know, meaningful timescale from our perspective is pretty low. And so this changes in both natural disturbance conditions and climatic conditions are driving pretty significant ecosystem changes with big implications for carbon sequestration, carbon storage. And so this is a figure, it's a bit outdated now because it only goes through 2012, but my colleague Leroy Westerling at UC Merced has been, you know, he tracks forest fire area, large forest fire area across the West. And, you know, I keep this one just because, you know, 1970s to you know, the 2012, right, the last decade there, 462% increase in annual large forest fires, right? So this is for 1,000 acres, right? 1,000 acre fires. So big increases in the area impacted by wildfire. I think when Leroy does this next, it'll probably be somewhere up here, you know, much higher. And then, you know, this is some work from Brandon Collins, who is another colleague of mine at Berkeley, and he evaluated, this is from California, but we see similar stuff here. He evaluated RAW's weather station data, so the remote access weather station data that weather stations that are distributed throughout our natural lands areas, and looked at changes in fire weather, and basically across this period up through 2020, just big increases in the number of kind of extreme fire weather days, right? And those are the days we get rapid fire growth. So all of our systems, we have no shortage of ignition. It's all the time, especially on 4th of July. And all it takes is that ignition coinciding with fuels that are dry enough to burn and weather that's extreme enough to escape initial attack, right? So that's kind of the punchline there is like the frequency with which we're having these days where fire can get up and run is increasing. And similarly, you know, there's a strong link. So this is Julie Mueller at NAU, strong link between area burned by high severity and then, you know, time, right? And this has a lot to do with severe fire weather, right? So we're seeing increasing high severity, so high mortality, high tree mortality fire events in the Southwest. So that brings us to the management piece, right? And so, you know, the stuff that is happening within the state, thinning and prescribed burning, and throughout the West is not novel. You know, it's not recently understood. We basically had an understanding of the role of fire in these ecosystems since probably the 1950s or 60s is when we started getting that. And then by the 70s, some of the management stuff became much clearer. And then by the late 80s and early 90s, it was pretty crystal clear what had to happen. And that's that we had much denser forests than we can support. And we needed to get fire back into these ecosystems. And I like these two pictures. One is real, George W. Bush, and then the other one is from the cover of The Economist, and it has nothing to do with forest management. But both of those administrations, right, made pretty, you know, there was a lot of focus on kind of restoring fire to these ecosystems, and then most recently with the two bills that passed a couple of years ago, Inflation Reduction Act and something, whatever. There's a lot of money for hazardous fuels reduction in there. Thank you, the Infrastructure Act. But anyway, we know what we need to do, right? And so in the Southwest, we really have a choice. And so this is from the Santa Fe fire shed area. A colleague of mine, friend, is the fuels manager on the Santa Fe. And they're doing first entry fire into there, and you know, you end up with a lot of green trees afterward, right? You kill some trees, which is fine because we got too many. The alternative is we sit back and do nothing, and this is in the footprint of the Las Conchas fire in the Jemez, and this is all oak, and those were all ponderosa pine, and the likelihood that this ends up as ponderosa pine again is much closer to 0 than it is to 1. So from a carbon perspective, what we're really talking about then is, you know, we're kind of in this condition where we have pushed these ecosystems way past the amount of carbon they're capable of sustaining under prevailing climate and natural disturbance conditions. And, you know, this figure I had the scientific illustrator colleague of mine do, but basically it shows this boom bust. And then the potential for boom again, which isn't real in the Southwest anymore. I mean, it's not a possibility. But we've pushed way past this plane of kind of what is stable in terms of carbon in the ecosystem. And what we need to do is we need to get back to a fire-maintained ecosystem where we're perturbing the system regularly and we're managing the amount of biomass per unit area such that we sustain live tree cover in the context of these disturbance events. So, you know, we've done some work looking at this, and this is that Santa Fe fire shed, which the municipal watershed sits right about there. But basically, a few years ago, we got a request to model that system, and there's a lot of stakeholder involvement in these things. And they had come up, the stakeholder group had come up with kind of a treatment plan. And so they had asked that we quantify the carbon outcomes from that stakeholder-driven plan. And I said, okay, that's cool, we're happy to do that, but I'm really interested in, you know, how do we use our understanding of the probability of high severity wildfire occurring on the landscape to inform where we put treatments. And I'd like to use your stakeholder-driven plan as a benchmark, you know. And we had done some of this previously in a different watershed, but then kind of took it to the next level here in the fire shed. And so we wanted to make that comparison and then look at, you know, basically when you go in and you perturb the system, so you do any sort of tree harvest and prescribed burning, you know, you're putting carbon in the atmosphere, you're hauling it away on trucks, or one of those two things. And so you have an immediate carbon debt from management, right? The ecosystem goes into the red. And basically, the idea is we can support a set amount of biomass per unit area, but how we structure that biomass really influences how likely it is to be killed by wildfire. And so if we push the system toward fewer larger trees rather than many smaller ones, we can make it more resistant to stand replacing wildfire. And so the question is, how long do we suffer that deficit till we can grow big enough trees that are resistant to stand replacing wildfire? So we do this work with this landscape, forest landscape succession and disturbance model called Landis. We use that ecosystem model to model carbon, nitrogen, water, and the like. And then a whole bunch of different components to look at fire and stuff like that. But we basically build these landscapes with forest inventory data, soil survey data, information about species traits, like how far do they disperse, you know, how long till sexual maturity and stuff like that. And then we bring in topography and all that information. And then we can subject that landscape to different actions, including projected climate. So in this particular case, what we did is we ran about 6,000 simulation years where we just randomly ignited fire across the landscape and watched how it interacted with fire weather, vegetation, topography, and the like. And then we used that information to estimate what the probability of stand replacing fire was within each 100-meter grid cell. So each grid cell was a hectare. And then we classified this landscape into fire based on fire risk, so the probability of high severity fire. And then, you know, and then we bend it up within that where, you know, you've got a higher elevation, middle elevation, low elevation. You've got your risk, and then you've got this slope greater than 30%. And so that's kind of like the magic number. Over that percentage, you can't operate. In most cases, you can't do that thinning with equipment. You got to do hand thinning, and so it gets a lot more expensive. And so we try and bend the landscape up that way. And so this is what the stakeholders gave us. It was a shape file of many different polygons, but functionally it was like, let's treat this ponderosa pine belt primarily, and we're going to do a lot of thinning and burning and a little bit of burn only. And so we ran simulations with that. And then we took this information and we said, okay, let's only allocate this thinning and burning to places where we've got real high risk of stand replacing fire. And let's do the work in the rest of it just with prescribed burning, because the veg conditions allow you to be able to do that pretty safely. So what we found in terms of the implementation of these from a management perspective is this one reduced the area thinned by about half, right? So, and then prescribed fire had to increase by about 24% in order to get the area treated that required it. And then, so the first pass is how does these two things stack up from a, you know, change in the fire severity. And so this is fire severity ranges from, you know, none to 5, which is stand replacing. So 4 and 5 are basically like 95% to 100% tree mortality. And so that prioritized one does a great job where all the work is done, but has relatively little influence outside of that. I mean, it brings it down compared to no management, but you still have quite a bit of active fire behavior can occur where you haven't treated yet. And then in the optimized case, we touch mechanically a smaller fraction of the landscape, introduce a fire a lot more, and actually bring down the fire severity quite a lot, with the exception of, you know, some higher elevation stuff where nobody's doing anything up there anyway because it's spruce fir, so you're just transmitting fire into that high elevation area. So then we look at the carbon piece really, which is like, you know, how long does this deficit persist? And so this figure is the cumulative difference in carbon balance, and the units are teragrams, so a lot. And then what we've done here is difference this from the kind of no management, right? And so what you see is both the prioritized and the optimized are running in the red for a while. And then the optimized scenario starts to hit, after about 20 years, it starts getting to the break-even point, and then it ends up storing a lot more carbon than the no management one over this 50-year simulation period. And that's because we paid a price up front with all the thinning and burning, and then maintaining those burns, but the net effect was a substantial decrease in the area that burns at high severity, which allows those trees to continue to grow and take up carbon. Whereas in the prioritized case, where it was heavily thinned and burned across the larger area, you see it's running in the red till about 2045 or so. So the punchline here is that the more you touch the landscape with more intensive management activities, the bigger the carbon cost up front, and the longer the time it's going to take in order to pay back that deficit if that's possible. So prioritize, so we, both reduced high severity fire. Net carbon uptake was higher in both management scenarios by the 50-year simulation mark. And then, we had lower upfront costs when we used risk to place our treatments and got carbon positive a lot faster. And so this is just one example of a whole body of work that really shows that in these fire-prone systems, especially with changing climatic conditions, reintroducing fire into the ecosystem and decreasing the current amount of carbon stored on the landscape is probably our best bet for maintaining a higher level of carbon storage over the longer term. And I'm going to contrast that with the alternative, which is a study we did looking at the Las Conchas fire footprint on the east flank of the Jemez. And so, this fire burned in 2011. It was, I think it was New Mexico's biggest fire for about 6 minutes. There was another, the Whitewater Baldy 2 years later blew way past it. But anyway, this blasted through chunks of the Cerro Grande and other, the Thompson, no, I don't remember all the names, but it blasted through a bunch. So this is an area that Colin Haffey, who used to work for the State Division of Forestry here, would call the heart of darkness because it's completely blasted out. But we were, looking at this landscape and trying to figure out as climate conditions change, what's the likelihood that it gets basically stalled out in kind of an oak, shrubland / grassland condition. And, we were saying, okay, well, let's hold climate constant and just look at, the frequency with which fire interacts with this landscape. And so we ran 3 scenarios, a low, medium, and high fire probability. So this is, this is basically saying, okay, we continue to have the same level of effectiveness as we've had over the last 30 years, 40 years in suppressing wildfire, which, we know is going downhill, but it's optimistic. And then the high fire is saying, okay, this is what the frequency of fire would have been prior to fire suppression. So back when we had both lightning and indigenous fire use on the landscape, how often was the Jemez burning? And then the medium was we just split the difference. We run these simulations, and this is like hectares of fire, right? And how the severity is distributed. And functionally what you see is that, you see a lot more acres are getting, or a lot more land area rather, is experiencing kind of this mixed severity fire. So in this particular case, what that means is a lot of tree seedlings getting killed because that's the leaf area that's dying when you were starting from small trees. And then, this is, again, land area, and then the probability that resprouters like Gamble Oak and New Mexico locust are going to make up more than 50% of the above ground biomass. And basically, as we push into higher fire frequency, we favor species that are capable of resprouting. So most of this stuff is, as my grad advisor liked to say, a painful elaboration of the obvious. But, that's ecological research most of the time. But then we were looking at like how this reinforces this kind of type conversion to a non-conifer state. And so, low, excuse me, this is that low fire frequency. So we end up, this is old conifer, old pinyon juniper, and then this is just open, so kind of grassland stuff. And then the bright green is resprouter, and then the lighter orange is young conifer. And you see over time you end up with, a decent fraction of the landscape is still in these old PJ, old conifer conditions, and you can actually increase, for example, the old PJ because there's establishment happening. And then as we increase the fire frequency, we end up with a larger fraction in open, and then increase it even more, and we end up with a very large fraction of that landscape in the open bin, so grassland, or in these resprouters. And so we can fundamentally change that landscape's composition as a function of fire frequency. And so, the punchline there is like, as we change ecosystem type, vegetation type, we end up with much lower net carbon uptake per unit land area, and we end up with much lower carbon stored across the landscape. The thing to keep in mind, though, is we're undergoing, you know, what I refer to as the great reorganization here in New Mexico and Arizona and California. And it's functionally, it's the disturbances from, you know, that are influenced by our past land use, interacting with changing climatic conditions, and it's totally reshuffling where species are capable of existing on the landscape. And that has pretty significant implications for carbon dynamics across these landscapes. And it also has significant implications for what we're capable of doing. So, you know, I think a great example here in the Southwest is that we've got these fantastic elevation gradients, you know, and you look at the range that any forest type covers, and at this point you would be absolutely insane if you to invest your money in trying to keep the lower boundary in place, right? Changing climatic conditions are making it so that what we call the trailing edge is moving up slope. And, you know, investing limited resources in trying to maintain, say, ponderosa pine at the ecotone with pinyon juniper is a losing battle. You know, you want to invest your resources at mid-elevation, higher elevation within that forest type range. And, you know, that's where you're also going to have the carbon gains. And so, you know, the punchline is there's some opportunities out there. There's a mechanism through Climate Action Reserve now for avoiding wildfire emissions. I don't know how the financial side of that works. I was on their technical advisory committee and looked at the modeling stuff that goes into that, but somehow they've monetized this. There's lots of reforestation opportunity, but slow growth means that until the price of a ton of carbon goes way up, I don't see how reforestation really pays for itself, because you spend all your money up front, you don't get any carbon offsets till down the road. There's some evidence to suggest that you can link like these, and I call it improved forest management, but it's really linked to this avoiding wildfire emissions and reforestation, and stage these things such that you can kind of build an economically viable portfolio. And there's a few carbon developers that are kind of working on that sort of thing. But I think, yeah, any questions?